Hello, Richard from budgetguitarist.com. Today I'm going to talk about necks. Before we get to the theme song intro, I wanted to mention something. A lot of what I've read about YouTube has suggested that you should not have a theme song and you should not try to put a bunch of humor in your videos because people are impatient and they're not going to stick around and they're on to the next thing. What I will try to do though is I will try to make the theme song more interesting, all 8.5 seconds of it. With that in mind, so let's talk guitar necks. We begin with the Fender American Strat neck. I'll show you what this looks like. This is a maple neck with a rosewood fingerboard. This has jumbo frets on it. It has string trees. I have put Fender compensated locking tuners on it, which I think are really good. This is my favorite Strat neck. I love the way it plays. I love the way it feels. It's a modern C-shaped profile. And if you were to buy one of these necks, just the neck, probably run you anywhere from $350 to $450 depending on where you buy it from. So some might consider that a lot of money for the neck, and some might say, well, what exactly makes that neck better than, say, this one? This is a Fender standard made in Mexico neck, also made out of maple, also with a rosewood fingerboard. This particular neck came with vintage frets, which are really, really small, which I didn't like, so I refretted it. I've actually refretted this neck so many times that there's not much fretboard left, and I've kind of retired it, so to speak. But I've logged a ridiculous amount of hours on this neck, playing this neck. So what's the difference between an American-made neck and a Mexican-made neck? Well, these days, not very much. In terms of the wood they're using, it's maple wood. So in theory, the maple wood that they would select for the American Strats would be a more expensive maple. And so what makes maple more expensive? Well, in some cases it's figured. In some cases it's older. Here's the thing about wood, especially wood for guitars. If you cut down a tree, say a maple tree, and you take that tree into the factory and you cut a neck shape out of it, and then you put it on a guitar, and then you put strings on it, you're going to be in big trouble. Because the moisture content, the water and the sap inside of that wood is going to be very high, and that wood is going to change shape over time. So wood used in guitars is usually aged. Sometimes they will also put it in a kiln to try to get rid of the moisture. So they'll store it maybe in a hotter than normal environment. There's a lot of different ways that wood can be stored and treated. But in general, it's pretty much agreed on in the guitar building industry that older wood is a better choice for guitars because the resins in the wood have crystallized and it's just become that much more solid and stable. Maple itself is a very, very hard wood. It's very strong, which is why it's used for necks so frequently. So in theory, it could very well be that the wood on the American neck perhaps was aged more than the Mexican. It could be, if you look at these two fretboards, you can see this one is darker and this one is lighter. In general, people prefer a darker looking fretboard. The type of rosewood used on the fretboard, whether it's darker, whether it's lighter, could factor into the cost. In some cases, companies will actually dye the wood to make it appear darker. That obviously didn't happen in this case. And I'd love to be able to definitively tell you about the wood, but the thing is, Fender doesn't really release that kind of information. In general, with guitar wood, it usually comes from the country that it's made in. But in the case of the Mexican plant and the American plant, which are basically an hour and a half apart, it seems pretty likely that they're sending similar shipments of wood to both factories. And with the increase of price in today's Mexican-made Fender Strat, it wouldn't surprise me if, at this point in time, if they weren't the same wood. Fender's not going to tell us, so it's sort of a mystery. But the next part is not such a mystery, and that is the craftsmanship, the workmanship that goes into it. American workers still cost more than Mexican workers. Now, for a long time, there was like a stigma attached to workers in other countries and how the American craftsmanship was the best. Yeah, that's a bunch of hooey, really. Some of the best craftsmanship I've ever seen has come out of Japan. It really doesn't matter what country a craftsperson lives in. It matters how good they are at their job. And how good they are at their job determines how much money they can make. However, some countries have higher wages than others. So Japan and the United States and England may have higher wages than a place like, say, South Korea or Mexico or China or Indonesia. So that doesn't really tell us much. But I can tell you, based on my experience, that in general, the level of fretwork on the American necks is definitely superior to the level of fretwork on Mexican necks up until somewhat recently. These days, if you sort of did like a blind taste test, so to speak, between an American neck and a Mexican neck, would you be able to tell the difference? It really depends on the model. So some things to look for. As you're running your finger up and down the side of the fretboard, are the edges rounded of the fret? Is it comfortable? Or are you coming across a whole bunch of jagged metal sticking out? Well, that's something to look for. Another thing to look for is as you bend the string, do you feel the resistance of the metal string on the metal fret, or is it pretty smooth and glidey? I don't know if that's a real word. So that would tell you the amount of polish that went into the fret. When you look down the fret lengthwise, like I'm doing right now, how are the frets crowned? And I mean, in general, again, it's going to be pretty tough to tell. So these are tough. Mexican and American made Strat necks, I think these days, I think it might be pretty difficult to tell the difference. And I don't know if I could tell. There's probably some people who could. That said, if I had a choice between an American neck and a Mexican neck, I would choose the American neck because in general, my experience in the past has been that they are the better quality necks. So that's American, that's Mexican. What about Squier? The only Squier Strat that I have is this one. And this is a Squier 2. I had it in a different video. This guitar was actually manufactured in South Korea. And honestly, it's a really, really good neck. The fretwork was really good. It plays really well. And something I find really interesting is the gloss on the back of the neck is thick enough that you cannot feel the skunk stripe. This can be an issue on some guitars. Like, for example, my Fender Telecaster. This is a made in Mexico Fender Telecaster. I've done a bunch of mods to this guitar. The tuners are original. The neck and the body are original. These are Texas Special Custom Shop pickups. And I have also installed compensated traditional brass saddles, which I think do have a big impact. But here's something I don't like. The skunk stripe on the back of the neck. As I run my fingers across it, I can feel the change in wood texture. So I can feel right where the skunk stripe is. So the skunk stripe, for those who don't know, is where the truss rod goes. What they do is they cut a big channel in the back of the neck. They put the truss rod in there, and then they take another piece of wood and they press it down and they glue it down, and then they put finish over the top of it. So on the Squier I just showed you, you can't really feel the skunk stripe. On this guitar, you can. And it is mildly irritating to me. I really don't want to feel that. I really want the back of the neck to be smooth. I don't want to be thinking about it as I'm playing the neck. Is it a big deal? No, not really. But it still bothers me just a little bit. So that might be another difference between Mexican and American. In some cases, maybe you can feel the skunk stripe. It could be because that wood is slightly higher. It could be because there's not enough finish on the back of the neck. It could be because when they sanded it, they didn't do a good enough job. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk quality and level of workmanship. So there you go. Okay, so one really good question then is like the difference between, let's say, like a Squier Affinity or a Squier bullet neck and like a Mexican or American neck. In my experience, those guitars have necks that are kind of similar to this Mighty Mite neck that I bought. So Mighty Mite is a company that sells replacement necks. Mighty Mite is the only replacement neck company licensed by Fender that are allowed to do the exact Fender headstock shape. So if you look at some other companies that have Strat type guitars, like here's an old beater neck that I picked up for $5 at a convention. This was a Charvel by Jackson. neck. And you can see the headstock shape. It's obviously different because the shape of the headstock is copyrighted by Fender. So Mighty Mite necks go for somewhere around $100, $120, somewhere in that range. And they remind me very much of the Squier Affinity necks. So what does that mean? Well, to me it means the Affinity necks are pretty decent, but again, running my hand across the back of the neck here, I can feel the skunk stripe, which is annoying. The fretwork on the Mighty Mite neck, when I got it in, I would call it pretty bad. I would say if you bought a Mighty Mite neck similar to this and put it right on your guitar without a level crown, you're going to buzz. You're going to have some buzzing. I believe what they did is they installed the frets and they didn't do a level crown at all. I don't think they bothered. So maybe you get what you pay for. Actually, I do have a Squier Affinity neck. Let me get it really quick. Here you go. This is a Squier Affinity neck. It also happens to be a bass. It also happens to be a bass that I removed the frets from because I wanted a fretless bass. By the way, if you want a fretless bass, you can pick up an Affinity Squier bass used for somewhere around $120, $130. You could pull the frets out, and I think it's a pretty darn good fretless bass for that kind of money. As a matter of fact, I think this Squier Affinity bass with the frets in is maybe the best bass in its price range. Anyway, on this particular bass, there is no skunk stripe. The workmanship, when it used to have frets, was pretty good, playable, and kind of similar to the Affinity necks that I've played in Guitar Center, Sam Ash, etc. So I would say the level of workmanship on the Affinity necks is decent. Now let's talk about the Bullet series. The Bullet series is really, really hit or miss. I've played a lot of Squier Bullets in my life. Most of the ones I've picked up, the fretwork has been terrible. And the fretwork is probably the biggest cost here. Now, in terms of the wood that they use, is it the same level of quality of wood that you would find in a Mexican or American neck? I don't believe so, but again, Fender's not going to tell us. We're just making assumptions. The Squier Bullets, I believe, are made these days in Indonesia, where labor is still really cheap. It's funny how cheap labor has gone over the years. It started out in Japan, and then that got too expensive, and it moved to Mexico and South Korea, and those places are now getting too expensive. So then it went to China, and when China is too expensive, it goes to Indonesia. When I can buy a guitar made in Mexico or made in South Korea, where I know that the wages in those countries have been going up, that's kind of a good thing. Hopefully Indonesia will see some rising wages also. So to kind of summarize, the quality in wood for guitar necks, my guess would be that the wood used in American Strats all the way down to the wood used in Squier Bullets, you're ramping down the quality. Or and what I mean by that is you're probably getting the most desirable wood, the highest grade of wood in the American series, and then all the way down to the Squier, where basically it's wood, yes. I think in some cases the wood is probably aged in really, really humidity controlled environments with the higher end necks, and more time and energy and effort and hours goes into the workmanship. It's true that CNC machines cut most of the necks these days, even in the lower end factories. So you could say the wood grades out higher, but I mean, honestly, I really do believe like a Squier Affinity neck could be playable. A Squier Classic Vibe neck could be very playable. If you were blindfolded, I'm not sure you could tell the difference between a Classic Vibe and a Mexican and an American, except for the amount of finish on the neck. So the level of craftsmanship has just gotten so good. Now there is one other factor, which would be, let me show you. The other factor is rounding the edges of the fretboard. So one really, really easy thing that you can do to make a cheap guitar play better is to get rid of the harsh edge on the edge of the fretboard. In a lot of cases, it's actually a corner, like the corner of a table, and it's very uncomfortable to play. So what the higher end guitar makers do is they take that harshness. Let me show you the angle. So it's like this, right? And so what they'll do is round it, so it's more like that. Also, timeout, holding, sorry, never mind. Been a long time since football, hasn't it? So that's something you can do yourself. you know, with some sandpaper or with a pencil or a screwdriver or something to just kind of round those over. In the case of something like a Squier Bullet, you're not going to find that. They're not going to take the time. In the case of something like an American Strat, they are. In the case of a Mexican Strat, I'm not sure. It depends on the model. So if I were going to summarize, I would basically say, I think there might be a little bit of a shell game going on with the necks between the Mexican and American guitars. I really can't speak definitively as to which wood is better. I can tell you American labor costs more than Mexican labor, and I can tell you that there's likely more attention, more time spent on the fret work on an American Strat versus a Mexican Strat. Does this mean you could take a Mexican neck to a really good luthier and have them do like really good fretwork on it and you would have an American neck? Well, maybe. But there's also that skunk stripe, you know, and maybe that doesn't bother you. But I really like it when I'm playing this neck and it's super smooth on the back and I can't tell the difference. I think that's worth something. I appreciate that. So there you go. That's sort of my take on the whole Fender neck situation thing. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you next Friday at 5.